All right. Well, welcome everyone who's here. I'm very excited about this panel discussion. I think we're all going to learn a lot. I am just here to welcome you from Postdoctoral Affairs. My name is Jenny Hoyt, and my partner here is Asia, who we work together in Postdoc Affairs. But it's Rebecca Mokri from Immunobiology at U of A who's going to run this panel. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Okay, so we have a really great panel today. So I'd like to welcome Doctors Morgan Carter, Carlos Vargas, Echo Warner, and Leanne Nieforth to thank you for being with us today and answering all of our postdoc questions relating to this really what is a black box of that transition between postdoc and faculty. And so to start off, I just want to let our audience know that we really want your participation. And so if you have questions, don't wait, go ahead and put them into the chat and we'll get to those right away. So we really want to hear from you. We do have some predetermined questions, but audience participation is always best. And from time to time, I might also call on the audience just to give a thumbs up emoji about a question, just so we can kind of gauge where everybody is at the moment. All right, so start thinking of those questions, pop them in the chat. And in the meantime, I would like to ask our panel to please describe your current job responsibilities. And if you would also let us know what year did you transition from postdoc to faculty? And so I'll just go in order of you on my screen here. So Dr. Carter, could you start us off?
Press unmute, but unmute. Hi, I'm Morgan Carter. I'm an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, which is an R2 institution. So we're a certain level of research, and we have a graduate program in biology, which is my department, for PhD students and master's students, but we maybe don't have the amount of administrative and resource and like physical resources that you might expect at an R1 institution. That also sometimes comes with higher teaching responsibilities. I'm actually kind of in a perfect little bubble here where I teach one class a semester, and I have my first year was teaching release. So I'm currently in my second semester. I left University of Arizona last fall, right around this time exactly, and started this job in January. So I've had 2 semesters now of no teaching, and then I'll start teaching a 100-person genetics class next semester. We don't really have a specific like percentage split here, so it's more about like how we count teaching. But essentially, I have that obligation to teach one course a semester, and then the rest of my requirement is fulfilled by having graduate and undergraduate students in my laboratory and having them enrolled in research credits. And then I also have a small expectation of service as an assistant professor, but I'm told that that gets to be more of a real thing once I get more towards tenure.
Thank you. And Dr. Nieforth, could you let us know where you are in your stage?
Sure. My name is Leanne Nieforth. I'm an assistant professor of human-animal interaction at the College of Vet Med at Purdue University in the Center for the Human-Animal Bond. So we are an R1, so I am 80% research, 10% teaching, and 10% service. My service will increase, I think I've been told as well, closer to tenure than after tenure. I teach one class a year. It's 1 day a week, a seminar for about 3 hours. And I was thrown into teaching my first semester. So I actually just left U of A and just started at Purdue this fall semester. So I am brand new, 10 weeks in. So smack in the middle of that black box transition. But it's going well so far, and I'm very much enjoying it.
Great. And Dr. Warner?
Hi, everyone. I'm Echo Warner. I'm at the University of Utah College of Nursing, which is at R1 university as well. And my makeup has changed a little bit. So I started my faculty position in the fall of 2021. So I've been here 2 years. My first year, I was 70% research and 30% teaching and 10% service. And then my second and third years, I'm 50% research, 40% teaching, and 10% service, which is pretty typical for most colleges of nursing. there tends to be a lot more teaching involved in faculty positions in nursing because there's such a shortage of nurse faculty. And for me, that has looked like I have taught one class a semester since I started. I've only co-taught at this point, so there's always been another faculty or two other faculty members assigned with me. And I only teach graduate courses for our DNP program and our PhD program. This semester, I'm actually off of teaching because I've been lucky to have some grant funding come in. And so our positions are sort of weighted by the amount of grant funding that we have to cover our time versus teaching time. So that's kind of my setup. And I have pretty minimal service commitments. Right now I'm on two committees, our PhD committee and our research committee in our college, and those meetings are about once a month. And I'm trying to remember if there's anything else. I do mentor graduate students. So I'm on one PhD committee. I have one pediatric oncology fellow that I'm a research mentor for. And then since my faculty appointment, I have also mentored a handful of Masters of Public Health students because that's what my background is in public health, even though I'm at a College of Nursing, which is a little bit tricky. I could talk about that more if anyone's interested.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Vargas.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Carlos Vargas. I'm an assistant professor and assistant astronomer in the Department of Astronomy here at University of Arizona. I'm somewhat potentially unique in that I transitioned to faculty from a postdoc position also at University of Arizona due to an interesting circumstance. I am in a classification of faculty that's called continuing status here at the university, which is equivalent to tenure track. We get continuing status once we qualify for continuing status in the exact same process as the tenure process. The only difference is my teaching load is replaced by an additional service load. So I don't have any formal teaching requirements. I can choose to teach if I want to, but I don't have to. It's not part of that tenure process. So I'm formally at 40% research and 60% service. Positions like this, you might say like, oh, how do you get this kind of a position? Who is this for? Positions like this at the university are typically for people who build instruments, lead international NASA missions like I do. So I need to be in specific places at specific times, and having teaching requirements can be very, very challenging for that. So it's replaced by a lot of service. So I'm on a kind of absurd amount of committees to make up that service load. Happy to talk about those too. But yeah, that's basically where I am.
Well, wonderful. Thank you all so much for those introductions. It doesn't look like we have any audience questions in the chat quite yet, so I'll just remind the audience, please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We really want to hear from you. No question too large or too small, just go ahead and stick them in there. And so until we get some of those questions rolling in, I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation. That's not a question. So I want the audience to give an emoji thumbs up if we've heard about some red flags that we should be looking at during that faculty interview process. I've heard my mentors talk about them. Look for the red flags, they say. I see a thumbs up. Thank you, Jenny. Do we have anyone else that's heard of these red flags? I'm sure people in the audience have heard of these red flags. And so I have heard about them, but nobody describes exactly what these red flags are. And so I'm hoping that we can get some of this input from our panel here. So I'd like to start with Dr. Nieforth, because you're one of, I think, the newer, the ones who have recently gone through this transition. And so you might be the perfect one to ask this question.
Sure. So I was trying to identify what I would say for this question. And I think the biggest one for me was the culture of the department during the interview process, and how the interview process ran, and how people were treating each other during that process. That sounds kind of crazy, but there were a few institutions that I went to for interviews that I just didn't agree with how people were communicating with one another, especially when conflict arose, no matter how small the conflict. And I think not only was I being interviewed, but in a sense, I was interviewing them for determining if it was the right fit for me. And at first, I was like, oh, that's no big deal, like it's just one mistake. But then it's typically a pattern, and if I'm seeing it during the interview process, I'd most likely see it in the job itself as well. So I think that was the biggest red flag that I came across. And then, so my position is different because I'm in the Department of Comparative Pathobiology, but I'm not a pathologist nor a biologist. I'm more of a psychologist. So when I was finding jobs, there's a very small niche of where I wanted to be and needed to be. And honestly, the department that I found myself in is not the one that I would have sought out. But kind of going through the process, a red flag was at other institutions was, well, you don't really fit here, so we're not really sure what your tenure is going to look like, and we're not really sure kind of how you're going to be a part of our department. And if they're saying that at the interview time point, clearly that is not probably going to be a good fit because of the implications of that process. And I think, again, even though they were willing to like bring me in and had the job posting that very much fit with what I was doing, it was a red flag that they hadn't really thought out kind of beyond, okay, we interviewed them, we hired them, what's next. So that was the second red flag, but I'll let someone else throw in a few.
So Dr. Warner, I'd love to hear your opinion on red flags.
Yeah. Again, my red flags were very similar to what Leanne said. I watched for the culture, the way that folks communicated with one another. I also asked during my interview process to speak with current students. I wanted to hear from their perspective what the culture was like with working with faculty. And I had the benefit of knowing my institution pretty well. I did my PhD and my undergrad and master's, actually, like a lot of time spent at Utah. And so I knew the culture here really well, but other places that I interviewed, I asked to speak to students. And one thing that is maybe unique to nursing, I mentioned that we have a lot of teaching generally. And so sometimes that can be a little bit hard to identify and really understanding, like, what does 30% teaching mean versus like 50% teaching isn't always very clear. And so I asked a lot of the newer faculty how many classes they were teaching and how many students they were mentoring. And I found at some universities, even though the teaching didn't sound like a heavy load, that there were a lot of early career faculty who were taking on many PhD students as mentees. And that isn't formally recognized the same way as like being assigned a class is a lot of the time. And so that was a red flag to me when I heard of really junior people having to take on a lot of mentees, because it just takes so much time and effort to do a good job mentoring those PhD students. So that was something that I watched out for specifically, in addition to all of the sort of like cultural dynamics and that type of thing between faculty and staff.
Well, we do have some audience questions rolling in, and so I think I'm going to jump to the next question, unless there's something Dr. Vargas or Carter wanted to add. So we have some questions. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just had one extra thing. I completely agree with everything that was said previously, but one extra layer to this that I think might be important. Again, culture is important, but one extra metric of that I find useful is watching how grad students are treated wherever you interview in particular. So grad student pay is sort of a reflection of systemic inequalities in academia as a whole. And specifically within an institution, grad students tend to be the canaries in the coal mine, sort of, for how the most vulnerable classes are treated. So I would always very much look to how grad students are treated in an environment as a gauge for culture, let's say. But that's all I want to add.
That was a great addition. Thank you. And so we have a question here from Sarah that is asking, is there something specifically valuable that you accomplished during your postdoctoral tenure that better prepared you for getting your current position? And I'd like to add to that, or is there something you think you should have done during your postdoc? And we'll bounce it to anybody who thinks that, yep, okay, to Dr. Vargas.
Yeah, so I might be unique in this, but this is a pretty relevant question to how I got my position. So I started off as a postdoc at UArizona here, and was given the opportunity to PI a proposal for a NASA space mission, a very large grant, which is not always the case at every institution. Most institutions, as far as I understand, don't allow postdocs to PI large grants. For some seemingly obvious reasons. They may leave with the money, so to speak, once they get a fully tenured job somewhere else. But I was given that opportunity, got the grant, and so had a $20 million lever arm for negotiation, so to speak. So I probably got the faculty job because of that achievement as a postdoc. So that's just, I'm probably pretty unique in that, but I think big advice is get your own grant money. It's typically a very, very good way to get some leverage in the negotiation on the job market.
Yeah, I can chime in next. I had way less grant money that I got to use as a bargaining chip. But I do think that fellowships or full-on grants are like the best thing you can do as a postdoc in terms of establishing independence and establishing your own projects. And I think everybody in this call, if you're not already having a conversation with your advisor about what projects you're working on, you'll be able to take with you or not, or where those boundaries are, you need to start that conversation to protect yourself. Because it's something that's going to come up in search committees when they are looking at stuff and asking for your references and trying to figure out if it's clear that you have things you can take with you or if you're going to have to start from scratch. And making that case as clearly as possible, like, these are the resources that I'll be able to bring with me. This is the money I would be able to bring with me. This is the topic I would be able to bring with me. And having your advisor support for that, or at least like an understanding of that between y'all. And that can be a dynamic understanding as well. Like my postdoc advisor and I still talk all the time. And we still have things where it's like, oh, I might start working on this. Or you working on that? Like to try to help navigate that independence even now. So I think that having those conversations as early as possible, and then you're going to feel more ownership about what you have already established as being more in your wheelhouse versus there, and that's going to just make your research statements better.
Dr. Nieforth or Dr. Warner, do you have anything to add?
I would echo everything that has previously been said. I definitely think pursuing funding as a postdoc that that you're lead on, or at least that you can like take some ownership over, is really key. I entered my postdoc maybe in a little bit of a unique position. I didn't have like a particular mentor that I worked with because of the structure of my postdoc. And so I had several different mentors, and I really tried to spend that postdoc period. My postdoc was pretty short. I was a postdoc for like a year and a half. And so I kind of entered it a little bit more independently than I think some folks do. But that helped me to really figure out, like I spent that time figuring out what it was like being a PI on projects. I had some grant funding that I brought with me, and really tried to use that time as sort of like practice for being a faculty member. And my mentors were really good about supporting that approach. And I think that really made it easy to transition into being a faculty member. That was the only thing I wanted to add.
I would agree and echo everything everyone said, except I would also add publish. I think we hear that all the time, but I had a mentor once tell me that you can publish your way into anything. And at the time I was like, oh, really? But you really can. So publish as much as you can. And then I also had a very short postdoc, but I managed an R01 while I was a postdoc. So though I wasn't the PI, I had the kind of management side of things and how it works within the institution and running the team from the science, but also running the team from the HR side, which was really helpful in my discussions. And then I think too, being able to answer how you differentiate yourself from your research mentor, have multiple ways. I think a lot of times we think of that question, we're like, oh, this is how I'm going to answer it. I was asked that question probably 50 times in one interview. I'm like, not kidding. With like all the panels and interviews I sat through over the time period I was at the institution. So you can't say the same thing that many times, and I didn't expect that many times. So I was finding myself trying to differentiate on the spot, which luckily I was able to, but just be really clear and understanding and make sure you have many layers that you could go into for that question. That's something that surprised me.
All right, we're going to jump to another audience question. And so this is from Nicole. So how was your negotiation and did you negotiate? And what did you negotiate for? And there's a second part to this question, but let's just talk about this part first.
I could comment on this because I did a fair bit of negotiating, especially when I kind of narrowed things down to the last two positions that I was considering. I really pushed for salary, number one, and the other thing that was really important to me was flexibility in my geographic location, because I'm in a two-person career like situation. My husband was finishing his medical residency and starting fellowship at the same time that I was finishing my postdoc and starting my faculty position. And so it was really important to me to be able to stay where I was at in Tucson for a year and a half until he started his fellowship. And so that was a big thing that I negotiated for. Obviously, I negotiated for other things like protected time for research and teaching release and that kind of stuff too, but really like pushing back on salary and startup funds were what made a big difference in my startup package. And one way that I was able to do that is by having competing offers. And even though like, if you know me personally at all, negotiating for a salary is probably like the most uncomfortable I've ever been in my entire life. And so, but everybody tells you, you have to do it, you have to do it. And it like turned out really well for me. And so I would definitely say, and I always really advocate for my mentees, like always push back on your pay because universities can afford to pay you more. And if you don't push back at all, then you're going to get the lowest offer that they're willing to give you. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I'll counter that a little bit just with I was also in a lucky position of having a couple offers that I was going back and forth on. And I did a lot of negotiation. None of it was on salary because at least at the public institutions I was interviewing or I was negotiating with, they had no wiggle room. Like there was nothing. This was the amount that was approved for that, but like that was it. There was nothing. You could say like, well, can you? And it was just like the most shut down no. Like absolutely not. There is no way. This was calculated by the dean as a specific percentage of the average of this amount across the country at public institutions. It was like, nope, that's it. So sometimes it is frustrating when you're like, okay, well, I can't do that. So then you come in with things like thinking about, okay, is this a 9-month position? Does that mean I can add on summer salary? How could I get summer salary? Something like that you might care about. So pay attention to what month your appointment is for and how that's going to pay into how much you're getting paid. That's something to keep an eye on. I think with negotiating, I was definitely focused on the list of equipment that I needed and I'll really focus on the like personnel that I was going to need. So I was negotiating for postdoc money, which I actually really didn't want. I just wanted technician money, but I converted that later. And then money for graduate student support so that my graduate students wouldn't be on teaching assistantships for the first couple of years. I will say I ended up in a really interesting position with the institution that I'm at. Negotiations are different a little bit everywhere. Typically, in my limited experience, the chair was often helping me through the negotiations, and they're kind of between you and the dean. And so they want to recruit you, they want to hire you. If you've gotten to this point of negotiating, they're trying to figure out what you need to be successful, but also navigating what they know the dean is going to say yes or no to. So it's an interesting balance that the chair's in, but use them to help you if you can. The one thing that I regret the most in my negotiations is that at my current institution, my startup is incredibly tied to the fiscal year. And so every part of my startup is budgeted for a specific thing in a specific year. And if I try to move it off of like for hiring a postdoc versus hiring a grad student, or if I try to move it from year 1 to year 2, I basically can't. So ask very thoroughly about how strict places are, because some places are just going to hand you a pot of money and say it would be great if you would spend this in the next 3 years, but if you don't, we'll figure it out. And then I'm in like the other side of the boat, which is like I lose money every year if I don't manage to spend it exactly correctly as I outlined. And I would have probably been a lot more careful about that if I had realized that this institution was that strict. So just getting as much clarity and maybe getting in touch with the most recent assistant professors that have gotten hired and asking them for tips and anything they might have learned at that specific institution would be really beneficial. Oh, wait, and I didn't get to answer the red flag question. But one red flag for me was about assistant professors. Like, how many are there? How recently were they hired? Am I going to be the only assistant professor? Like, do they keep leaving? So, like, learning kind of what's going on with the assistant professors recently is also helpful.
And I can share a little bit about my negotiation. So I negotiated for startup and summer salary. So I also was not able to argue for or negotiate for salary at all. It was set at a certain way for equity purposes across the university. That's what I was told. So I negotiated for startup, and in that had to present an itemized budget for the next 3 to 5 years. However, I don't have to, I'm not married to that budget, which is great. And then summer salary, I recommend that. One thing I regret not negotiating for was hybrid. So I came, like my PhD was during COVID. Then my postdoc was hybrid in many senses of the term. So when I started, I was shocked to know that I have to work from the office about 8 hours a day. And there's no flexibility in that. So that was a rude awakening, but it's something that I wish I had written to the negotiation. And if I had known, I would have.
Yeah, and I can round us out too, I think. So my negotiation was kind of interesting. So starting with salary. So I know there are some institutions that will push back on this and say, hey, like this is all we can pay. I think that's somewhat of a cop-out at the higher levels of the university, to be honest, but that's my opinion. In any case, I think you should still try and ask. And it's important for 2 big reasons. One being your incoming salary sets how much each of your future raises will be as a percentage, since they're always going to be a percentage. So the more you get in the beginning, the more you'll end up with at the end, and that's important. And it also can sometimes set your incoming peers' salary as well. So you will be helping the people behind you who will be getting jobs at this institution in the coming years by raising that bar of salary, by negotiating a little bit higher every time. So I think it's important to at least give it a shot. And another thing that's very, very often misunderstood or not taken into account with salary negotiations is it's extremely important for people coming from certain backgrounds. So for example, my family's extremely poor. So I have to send money basically every month to my parents so that they can cover their living expenses and literally not live on the street. So this isn't true for everybody, but it's most often true for Black, Hispanic, Indigenous people in the US. So I think people often get a little get their feathers ruffled when talking about salary, but it means really different things for different people. So we should become okay with talking about it at least. Anyway, so that was my salary negotiation, but I also negotiated startup, really important due to the lab nature of the work I do. One thing to keep in mind, I think there's a lot of great things already said about startup, so I won't add anything else. But I also interestingly negotiated a partner hire for someone who isn't my partner. So for this project that I mentioned that got funded, so the project scientist on this mission who was working under me was also a postdoc at the time. And I didn't want him to leave. It would really actually hurt the project for him to leave and go somewhere else and get another job. So I negotiated for him to also be hired on as faculty during my negotiation. So anything's possible except a parking pass. That was one thing they were like, we'll never pay for your parking. Don't even ask.
Well, great. It was wonderful to hear all of your opinions on that subject and greatly appreciate it. I'm jotting down advice as we go, so hopefully maybe I'll have to rewatch the recording for some of it. Okay, so we're going to jump to another audience question. We have another one from Sarah. And so she says that the true kind of pillars that we always hear about and that have already been discussed today for tenure track success is, as in your postdoc, have grants and have publications. And then, as you all have also noted, differentiate yourself from your PI. But what are maybe some other things that we can do as postdocs, maybe that are seen as, you know, less important, but still were quite important in the actual interview process? So I feel like I see Dr. Carter saying like she might think of something. So please, Dr. Carter.
I want to make a plug for a program at the University of Arizona. So through the CERTL program, there's a postdoc pathway for teaching that is developed. It's a 1-year program to get pedagogy experience as a research postdoc. I highly, highly recommend participating in this program. And so far of the participants we've had, almost every single one of them, as far as I know, has said that this has helped them with their faculty interviews, has helped them write their teaching statements, has helped them do mock teaching parts of their interview that may come up, has helped them get through conversations about whether or not they have teaching strategies, what they might like to teach, and all of that stuff. So I know that we put so much effort into publications and grants, but there's a lot to a faculty job that's not just publications and grants. So for whatever that looks like in your field, if you can show like, I've thought about teaching, I've thought about service, or like my role in a professional society, or how I do outreach or policy or something. If you can find these things that show that you've thought about like the whole of this job, I think that's always going to be really beneficial and set your package apart.
To agree with that, I think teaching and mentorship too. So demonstrating that not only do you have mentees, but they're happy and you've done some professional development in terms of how to be the best mentor that you can be. During my PhD, actually, there was like a mentoring fellowship that I was a part of, as well as a teaching certificate. So I think both of those things came up in the interviews and were directly asked kind of what I would take from those things into my faculty position and kind of what my lab would look like on that front. So I think kind of the mentorship piece and the teaching, they're pretty interrelated, but being able to clearly articulate that and share direct kind of anecdotes from your experiences is really critical.
Anyone else want to add any other points? All right, so and Jenny has put the link for that CERTL program into the chat. So if you're interested, please go ahead and click on that link. And then another audience question from HK. They are asking in terms of their CV, and I think I'll kind of put this in a nutshell. If they have, you know, if maybe your CV isn't what you would like it to be or what you could have gotten, maybe you have no grants, or maybe it's not as good as someone else's CV. What can you do to emphasize those really strong points that you have? And I'll shoot it to Dr.
I had really good advice from a mentor when I was writing like my personal statement for my faculty applications, and their advice I think may help you think about how to portray yourself in your applications if you don't necessarily have, you know, myself included, did not have a $20 million grant on my resume or on my CV in applying. I did have some grant funding, but not like that level. But in the personal statement, it's really your opportunity to tell your story. And so I try to really focus on understanding what the institutions were looking for in a new hire, and to explain in my personal statement, like regardless of the grants or publications that I had, like why I was the perfect fit for what they were looking for. And I think there's a lot of power in storytelling. And so I really emphasized in my personal statement, like I talked about my background is a first generation college student, that I came from a rural community. Like those were really important personal things that I could bring to the table that weren't necessarily obvious from looking at my CV, but I knew were really valuable to the institutions that I was applying to. Because I applied to a lot of places that have rural catchment areas, and my background, my research focused is on rural health disparities and things like that. And so it made a lot of sense to tell my story in that way. And so I think if there's something unique about your story that you can tell in your personal statement, I think that can be really eye-catching to people, especially if it relates to the aspects of the job that they're trying to hire for.
Yeah, I think one other thing, so this comes up a lot, especially if you think about that, a lot of international trainees can't apply for the same fellowships that domestic trainees can, right? So we have a lot of pre-doc and postdoc fellowships that are not, you're not eligible if you're not a US citizen. So then you kind of end up in this predicament of like, well, how do I show that I could do that if I don't have the opportunity to do that? And so I think a lot of that is kind of to echo is like to think about like how can you best sell yourself, and showing off your agency. And so a grant is a really easy way to be like, look, I can communicate my science, like my science is important. I sought out this thing, I did this thing that wasn't required of me to do, that is advancing my career and is advancing where I'm at. So if you can kind of show those things in other ways, like maybe you've done other versions of science communication activities. Maybe you sought out your postdoc position. Maybe that wasn't a position that was posted, or you've taken it in a really different direction. You reached out to establish a collaboration for that. Maybe you have been instrumental in a collaborative arrangement that isn't formalized in a grant, but is something that you initiated that you can bring up. So it's all about finding the moments where you've gone above and beyond what your basic job is essentially, and have looked towards building your career. So whether that's getting a grant, or it's just doing something else that shows that you have the same skills that go into getting a grant, or other aspects of being a professor, I think can be really helpful. And make sure to look for small internal grants, travel awards at conferences. I know that the Bio5 initiative, like Institute at University of Arizona, has a small postdoc fellowship. So looking for those things that don't necessarily have citizenship requirements can be another good way to get even just smaller dollar amounts, but it's still showing that you're like taking initiative.
Yeah, I think that's all fantastic stuff already said. I might add just a couple of other kind of minor additions. In terms of telling the story, which is really important, tailor your applications to the places you're applying to. Don't just mass apply. It's not going to work out that well. Look at the resources that individual institutions have. And if you can, even if you don't have a grant, you can write a story. You could tell a story that's like, hey, I'm going to apply to these specific things at your institution that I can only do at your institution, or I can best do at your institution because you have XYZ resources or ABC people who would be collaborators on similar projects like that. So just try to make sure you're a good fit for the place you're applying to. And a lot of times places pick, well, I think all the time places pick people who are the best fit. I also would say maybe a more minor thing, but when writing things like DEI statements and maybe even teaching statements, it's a good idea to look at the physical region of the institution you're applying to. If it's in an urban area, look at demographics of that urban area. Think about what kind of programs you can set up. How can you actually help the community that you're going to be integrated into if you get that job? Those kind of things can really help tell a story of how you'll be more than just a researcher living under a rock, so to speak.
I think I agree with everything that's been said, but one additional thing that I looked into was the strategic plan for the college and the department. So on pretty much every website I looked, you have to dig a little bit sometimes, but you can find like the Word doc strategic plan for the college and department. And if you can tie those two things and goals, like strategic goals for 2023 or 2024, into your statements on how your work could play into those goals, that not only shows that you're really interested in that particular place, but also what you can do once you get there and how well intertwined your work will be regardless of what you've done in the past. I also want to note that if you apply for some of the big grants or fellowships or small grants, I think it's more applicable to larger grants, and you don't get them, I think sometimes people do list them on their CVs and say, I'm going to resubmit this on this date based on feedback. And you can, depending on how your CV is structured, you can kind of adjust that accordingly. But I have seen that done in the past. And sometimes it shows initiative, and it shows that, you know, because you're not going to get every grant that you apply for. At least, I don't know, I'm definitely not. So I think, you know, showing that when you get knocked down, you're just going to stand up and do it again, I think shows a lot as well. Again, I think it depends on your department and the institution, but consider that, at least talking about that, if you're asked.
Fantastic. So we have a question from Roger, which it sounds like Dr. Warner has actually already answered, but I'll just make sure this is clear across the board. How is the split between research, service, and teaching done? So Dr. Warner, you said this is really department and institution specific. So is there any negotiation room on this at all?
Yeah, I think there's definitely room for negotiation, and it's a really hard question to answer because I think it's just so unique and dependent on the institution and even the college within the institution. Like my College of Nursing defines 3 credits, a 3-credit course as 30% teaching if you're teaching that every semester, but it's like that's just how my college does it. Even in my institution, different colleges assign things differently. And honestly, for me, it's been a little bit of it still feels like a little bit of a black box to understand how those decisions are made. And I'm like in my 3rd year of my faculty position. And so it's still something that I'm like, I have this much grant funding. And so why am I still teaching like this number of classes? It's really confusing. I don't know. Maybe others have more clarity on this, but I could talk about this for the whole hour by myself.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier too, it's super institution department specific. It's all made up. So one I would highly recommend in your interviews, you're gonna have moments where you have to ask them questions. One great question is, what's the anticipated split of this? What does that look like in practice for somebody on a similar split? What have the previous research professors or assistant professors incoming done? How have they handled that? What have been the first classes they taught? Stuff like that, because you can have the same exact math between 2 different departments of the same school and they'll have different answers. So
Actually, can I just make a really quick follow up to that, because it reminded me of something that came up in my negotiations. So when I was negotiating, I had like a certain percent of protected time for research for my first 3 years. And one thing I didn't know to ask about that I really wish I would have asked is if during that time frame I receive grant funding, like how does my grant funding fit with the protected research time? Because what I didn't know at the time of applying is that the 50 or 70% protected time that I had, like my grants that I got funded did not add on to that. And I didn't know that when I was first applying. And so I would just like very specific details like that can feel a little bit hard to know, like what to even ask about. And so it's a little bit like hindsight's 2020, but I would try to be as specific as possible when talking to like the chair that you're interviewing with and understanding, like, if I do get grant funding during this time that I have protected time for research, like how does that determine my teaching load or my service load and things like that.
All right, that actually has cleared up a few things for me because I was very confused about that too. Dr. Vargas, did you want to?
Yeah, there's only one kind of minor extra thing I wanted to add. Again, this is really a black box. Everyone does it differently. My department has very, very recently just started talking about implementing a points system to track service loads. And I don't know how I feel about that yet. But this may be a sort of thing that more departments start talking about to kind of try to quantify things a little bit more, because sometimes certain people do a lot more service than others in the same types of positions. So just so you're aware, this might be a thing that happens eventually.
All right, I'm going to switch gears a little bit on the questions from what you did as a postdoc to prepare to your actual position now. So a question that is actually from me, I'll take advantage of my position as moderator to ask, is there something that you dislike about the tenure track position? And how do you overcome that dislike and turn it into a positive? And so who should we, Dr. Neeforth, could you go first?
I feel like perhaps I'm the least qualified to answer this question because it's only been 10 weeks. However, thus far, I think I already hit on what I dislike, and that is that I'm expected to be in my office 8 hours a day. And my office is a very small window, and I'm a person that likes to sit outside with the breeze and watch my horses in the pasture while I write papers. So kind of finagling that and figuring out what that looks like for me. I actually have a meeting with my department head on Friday as a check-in, and I'm going to mention, I write way better when I'm not in my office. Can we talk about, figuring that out for me? So I think that is the thing I don't like. I also, the onboarding process for me has been extremely confusing. No one knows what I'm supposed to be doing or when, and I keep getting emails still. You haven't done this training, you're gonna get in trouble. And I was like, well, now I know I need to do it. So doing that training and keeping a list, that way the next person that gets hired, I can hand a list to and say, nobody's gonna tell you this, but these are the trainings that you need to do. So I think the way I've gotten through that is just by reaching out I did my PhD at Purdue, so it's not brand new to me. And I have mentors kind of across campus because I'm a super interdisciplinary based scientist and my PhD was super interdisciplinary. So kind of reaching out to people that I know in other departments and figuring out kind of what their onboarding practices are and kind of filling in the gaps by asking has been how I deal with that. But
Yeah, I think I have maybe a couple things. So one very, very general vibe sort of thing is change happens extremely slowly. So especially culturally. So a lot of the service stuff I do is related to DEI. I'm on also at the college level, and there is change to be had. There's progress to be made, but it is very slow and it is a tedious process. So that's just maybe one small thing I may dislike sometimes. And another thing, again, this was sort of said before, well, it was definitely mentioned before, but on startup and dealing with your startup and the nitty gritty of, oh, well, here's a pool of money from RII and here's another pool of money from this other place. You can't use this for certain things, but you can't use that for other things. No one's going to explain that to you unless you actually sit down and talk to the business office at your department. Maybe someone would talk to you, but no one talked to me at least. So I just be very proactive about that and aware. That's something that drives me crazy all the time. I have to be a little bit of an accountant as well as an astronomer sometimes.
Yeah, I run into a lot of walls that I don't know they were there until I ran into them, constantly. And as somebody who really likes to follow the rules and do what I'm supposed to do, that has been a huge adjustment. I don't get told what the right way to do something until I try to do it the wrong way. If I ask 5 times for the right way to do it, I still don't get told until I did it the wrong way. So trying to learn, the pools of money, trying to understand. It's basically starting a small business, but within the context of a giant bureaucracy. And so there's all these rules that apply to you, but they're also well, you just need to start your lab and get the ball rolling. And you're okay, so how do I spend money? It took me 3 weeks to figure out how to spend money. And that was the one goal I had when I started, because I had a really short window to spend my first year of startup. The onboarding is pretty terrible everywhere. It's especially terrible if you start in January, heads up, if you end up with a spring start. I didn't get employee onboarding. I got nothing. When my technician started, she got way more onboarding than I did. And not because of me, just the university ignored the fact that I existed in January. So that's been difficult, and I don't have that very much of a regular check-in with my chair or even much of a strong mentoring situation here. That's something that I really wish I did have. And one way I've been getting around that is going to happy hour. So we have an informal faculty happy hour that about 4 faculty go to every Friday, and I get 95% of my information about how things work, how to do things, what I should be doing from going to that faculty hour. So showing up to some of the optional things can seem superfluous at first, but can end up being like a good resource for knowing where the walls are before you run into them.
Okay, I think I'm the last one. There are lots of things that I really dislike about being a faculty member, but there are more things that I love about it. So I think that no matter what job we have, like there are just going to be things that you don't enjoy. I hate sitting in faculty meetings for 3 hours once a month. It's like my most detested thing that I have to do for my job. And so I've tried to like do a lot of reframing about some of the way that I have to spend my time. Like if I had my choice, I would be 100% research focused, and like that would be the only thing that I'm doing. But I love mentoring students, and so I also want to be involved in some teaching. And so I've tried to like reset my mindset a little bit when I do have those long faculty meetings. I turn my camera off on Zoom and I will go for a walk, or I'll like do a yoga class while I'm listening. And the culture of my college is that like that's okay. Like that's actually encouraged at my department, to spend some time outside every day, take breaks in between meetings as you can. And so like there are things that I love about where I'm at. I love the culture here. It's very family friendly. It's very friendly to like quality of life. And those things were really, really important to me. And so part of that is what drove how I ended up here. And the other thing that I think I really struggle with about a faculty position is that I didn't get this very much as a student or a postdoc, but there's so many politics, and like there's so many there's a lot of like infight. I don't know if this is the same in other departments, but there's a lot of history between faculty who have been here. And so the politics and like the he said, she said stuff, it like that just is hard for me to stomach sometimes. It's not something that I ever want to be involved in. And so a lot of the time, like I've found myself kind of putting my head down, and I just try to be nice to everyone and not take sides on things. And I didn't really expect there would be that much of that happening. But I think it's just kind of the case in a lot of academic settings. And so I think it's just something that, I do my thing, and I try not to burn bridges anywhere. But I wanted to echo also that the onboarding process is terrible. I think a lot of it is that we're just sort of expected at this point to be able to know how to ask questions and advocate for ourselves. And so at 3 years in, I am still getting emails of like, you never did this training. Do you need to be on probation for this? And I'm like, I don't know. I didn't know about this training. And so I think it's good to normalize that. And hopefully the conversation we're having today and other conversations that you have as you're interviewing and starting your new faculty positions will help to normalize that a little bit. And it's totally okay to just email your chair or another colleague and say, I need to do this. I need to spend money, but I don't know how to actually do that, or I need to submit this IRB application and I don't know who the person is. It's very normal to have those kind of questions and to not know what you're doing. In fact, it felt a lot like kind of going back and restarting my PhD program, where I was like, okay, I have no idea how any of these systems work. But there are people at your institute, and it's their job to help you figure that out. And no one expects you to come in knowing all of the things.
Well, this whole panel is equal parts enlightening and terrifying for me. So I don't know how the other postdocs are feeling, but this is wonderful. So we have just a couple minutes left. So we're gonna I also feel like the theme of this conversation has really been advocate for yourself. And so I think every time that we've had a question, someone has touched on that in their response. So that's the message I'm getting out of this: self-advocate. Okay, so we just have 3 minutes left. So I'm going to ask everyone to keep their responses to 30 seconds or less on this next one. So can we end with giving current postdocs one piece of advice for moving into a tenure track position? So it's got to be the golden piece of advice you could offer. And we'll start with Dr. Carter.
Be realistic about what you want and what you're worth, and If you're not interested in moving to that state, don't apply to a job there. Like be authentic because you're not gonna be happy. So like it only, cast a broad net, but it still needs to be a net that you're gonna be happy with what you catch. So that's gonna set you up the best and it's gonna make you advocate the best for yourself because you're gonna be passionate about where you're applying.
Dr. Warner?
My advice is find your people. Wherever you take a position, find the people who will have your back, the people that you can go to happy hour with, the people you can ask questions and not feel silly for asking questions. And yeah, have a what's the quote? Like, have a job, work so you can live, don't live so you can work. That's always been my motto. And so I found a place that supported that culture. And that was the lifestyle that was important to me. So know what's important to you and find your people.
Dr. Vargas?
So Echo, hope you don't mind if I kind of copy that, but also add to it. So finding your people is super important personally, but also on a research level too. So I initially, when I was a grad student and postdoc, kind of gravitated to trying to network with the big shots, right? With the more established people. But I think it's better to network with people at your current career stage, with your peers, kind of more laterally, because those are the people you're going to be having career-long collaborations with too, research-wise, as well as personally. So I think finding your people is very, very important.
And Dr. Newport?
And then I think for me, it's have boundaries and know when to say no. I think that's something that people try to drill into your head. You have to learn how to say no. You have to learn how to say no. But I think it goes beyond saying no and kind of understanding where you find your identity. And a lot of us, I think, especially when we start, there's so many things that we need to get done that it's like, oh my gosh, I need to spend 24 hours in the lab and doing what I'm doing. But finding your identity or what makes you you, if that's your work, fantastic. But for most, I think it's kind of beyond work and just kind of making sure that you're prioritizing that as well through your saying no and boundaries with the work-life balance.
Well, thank you so much. That was so, again, enlightening for me. And I think it really shined a light for many of us on a process that is very much, as I said in the beginning, a black box. So I so appreciate your time. Jenny, is there anything you want to add to end?
This has been absolutely incredible. All of you are amazing, including you, Rebecca, being an amazing moderator. So this couldn't have gone better. I feel like I've learned several things and I've been around a long time. So I appreciate so much this participation and thank you for letting us record because I've already gotten emails from people saying, I can't be there, can I see it? So this will be so enlightening for so many people. Thank you.
Thank you all again.
Thanks, y'all.
We stop the recording, I guess.